Okay, now we are ready for separation of church and state. This is a very big component of liberalism. It's a big component of secularism overall. So we want to break this down in the same way that we did with the other concepts. So first, a definition. How do we define separation of church and state? We can look at the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is supposed to be, the crown jewel of the U.S. Constitution, the crown jewel of Western political thought in general. This idea of separating church from the state. The government cannot make any law that establishes religion as like the official religion of the country, or benefits one religion over the other, or promotes the ideals of one religion over others. And then the second part of the clause, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the government shall not make any laws that prohibit the exercise of a particular religion. So these two clauses of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, what's called the Establishment Clause, first one, and then the Free Exercise Clause, the second one, these are the two defining ideas embedded within the First Amendment, which is an encapsulation of separation of church and state. So is this something that is acceptable in Islam? Is this value of separation of church and state instituted within the Sharia and within Islam as a whole? Well, let's look at the Establishment Clause. Is it the case that the Sharia does not have any laws that respect the establishment of a particular religion? And is it the case within the Sharia that the Sharia does not have any laws that prohibit the free exercise of religion? So on both counts, Islam is not recognizing either establishment or free exercise. So the Sharia establishes Islam as the religion of the state, as the religion of society. And Islamic law governs everyone within the control of the Islamic State. So that includes Muslims primarily, but also non-Muslims, Ahlul Dhimma, Ahlul Kitab. So they have to follow the guidelines of the Sharia. The Sharia is dominating over them in that way. So that's the establishment of Islam as the official religion of the Islamic State. And then when it comes to free exercise, yes, there are many provisions within the Sharia that prohibits the free exercise of religions other than Islam. And when you study ahkam of Ahlul Dhimma, this becomes very clear. You have all kinds of provisions within the Sharia that restricts the exercise of Christianity, of Judaism, definitely when it comes to shirk, and when it comes to Hinduism and Buddhism and all these other religions. There are many restrictions on the practice of those religions. So the Sharia does not respect separation of church and state. There's no such thing as separation of mosque and state. And therefore, Islam is not a secular religion, right? And there are religions who are secular. Christianity, as we discussed already, has this conception of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto the Lord, unto God, what is God's. So there's a separation there that's acknowledged. We're going to see the coherence of this idea of separation, but clearly it's not the case within Islam. Now, whenever I present this to Muslims, they say, well, what about la ikraha fid din? La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion True guidance has become distinct from error, as is mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah. So they will point to this ayah and they'll say this is exactly the kind of religious freedom and separation of church and state that is so good in the rest of the world, and we have it in the Quran explicitly. So Islam is all about respecting people's religion and separating governance from religious considerations because of this ayah. You can't coerce and force people to abide by a religion that they don't accept. So if we actually go and read tafsir, you'll see that there is no acknowledgement of this very secular, broad notion of religious freedom. No scholar accepted it historically prior to the modern period, prior to colonialism. No scholar was advocating this concept of religious freedom prior to colonialism. So these are just new claims where there's a dominant secular paradigm, modernist paradigm that is taken over the world. And so you have some Muslims who either they're confused by that or they're selling out. But prior to colonialism, prior to the dominance of the secular West, no scholar was pointing to La ikraha fid din and saying that, oh, well, this means that we have to have equal status for Muslims and non-Muslims. We have to have laws that do not discriminate on the basis of religion. No one has said this. Whether in fiqh, whether in tafsir, whether in any part of the Islamic sciences. And for good reason, because again, just like any ayah of the Quran, any nas that you can bring, you have to look at all the nusus. You have to look at all of the indicants within Revelation. And it's not just the Quran. Look at the practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Look at the practice of the Sahaba. Allah be pleased with them all. Where are they distinguishing these kinds of secular concepts? No, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam established an Islamic state. And there were non-Muslims in Medina. Clearly, there were non-Muslims in Medina, Jews and a minority of Christians as well. And they were under the rule of the Muslims. They could practice religion in a certain defined scope, but it was a limited scope. And that scope is defined by what the Sharia allows. They can't just practice their religion freely and openly, as we will see. But just think about the basic aspects of the seerah. For example, when the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca, one of the first things that he did was to destroy the idols, the asnam of the mushrikeen. He destroyed them. How is that respecting religious freedom? He is, first of all, establishing Islam, Tawheed, as the religion of Mecca and Medina, the central part of the Arabian Peninsula, that would then be spread forcefully through the rest of the peninsula, and all shirk was wiped out. Okay, so he's establishing Islam, and he's prohibiting the free exercise of shirk, of these pagan religions. And he's restricting Ahlul Kitab to a certain degree as well. So this is completely contrary to religious freedom and the secular concepts. And really what punctuates it is when you look at something, a historical document like the Aqd, or what's called, translated as the Pact of Umar, the second Khalifa of Islam, radiallahu anhu. So in this pact, this is when the Muslims gained control of Sham, and there are many Christians living in greater Palestine and greater Syria, and you have a pact that Umar establishes with the people there, with these what are now religious minorities. They're religions who are not in power, and Islam is the dominant power under the Khilafah of Umar. So then what are the kinds of provisions in this pact? So you had a prohibition against building new churches, new synagogues, new monasteries and places of worship. Okay, so this is a big restriction. The worship places of non-Muslims must be lower in elevation than the lowest mosque, than the lowest masjid in the area. So this is making the non-Muslim places of worship lower physically. The houses of non-Muslims must not be taller in elevation than the houses of Muslims. Okay? And this is keeping non-Muslims in a bottom level, at a lower level than Muslims. Prohibition of Christians and Jews against raising their voices at prayer times. So when it's time for the Muslims to pray, Christians and Jews are prohibited from raising their voices. But this is a one-way rule. It's something that favors Muslims and Islam, and it puts a restriction on Christians and Jews. Christians were forbidden to show their religion in public on the roads or in the markets where Muslims are. So that could be in terms of their certain symbols, like a cross. They are not allowed to proselytize, to do their da'wah to Muslims, but Muslims are allowed to do da'wah to Ahl al-Kitab, Ahl al-Dhimma. This is something that, again, is one way. Palm Sunday and Easter parades were banned, so they can't, again, publicly celebrate these religious holidays. Prohibition against preaching to Muslims in an attempt to convert them to Islam, from Islam. Prohibition against preventing the conversion to Islam of someone who wants to convert. So if someone wants to become Muslim, they can convert. But if someone wants to leave Islam, that is not allowed. And there are heavy consequences. This is ridda, and there are hudud against this. And we're going to talk about the hudud in great depth in this series of courses, inshallah. Now we're just laying the groundwork. The appearance of the non-Muslims must be different from those of the Muslims. So preventing tashabbuh, basically trying to imitate non-believers, imitating the kuffar, that's prevented. Why? I mean, there are wisdoms to all this, but for now, just reflect. Why should there be a very clear difference between Muslims and non-Muslims? Prohibition against any possession of weapons. So the Ahl al-Dhimma can possess weapons unless they're actually going and fighting with Muslims in jihad. And then prohibition against non-Muslims to lead, govern, or even employ Muslims. So basically, it's just preventing non-Muslims from having a hand over Muslims in all of these domains. It's to maintain the superiority of Muslims. And this has a psychological effect, obviously. It has a big psychological effect. And what's the point? What's the point of all of this? You want to establish Islam because Islam is the best for humanity, all human beings. And therefore, you want to incentivize conversion to Islam. You want non-Muslims to feel the pressure from all of these restrictions so that they will convert, to Islam and therefore enjoy the benefits of an established Islamic state, established Islamic law. This is exactly how you do it. You basically incentivize through all of these kinds of rules and regulations. Actually, the Aqd of Umar is much longer. I only took a selection of these provisions that were found, but it's actually a very long list. And it's just to clarify to you that this is establishing Islam as the religion of the state, and it's prohibiting the free exercise of all religions other than Islam. And ultimately, it's based on this logic that Islam is the best for humanity, and we need to incentivize non-Muslims to become Muslims. We're also prioritizing the interests of the Ummah. Okay, very important. The Ummah is number one. We have to have an Ummah first mentality. And so, of course, the Sharia is going to prioritize the interests of Muslims, the dunyawi interests Obviously, the interest in the akhirah, but also the interest in terms of material are prioritized for Muslims. Again, this does a great deal to change the mentality of Muslims for sure, and also non-Muslims, because there's an incentive. Just think about the control and the power of the secular modernist paradigm. And just by virtue of the West and the secular regimes being materially prosperous and being in this position of control for history for about the past 300 years, just by virtue of that, even if they didn't have any colonial project, any imperial project, any kind of wars and invasion against the Muslim world, even if it were just that fact of political dominance and economic wealth, that in itself has a psychological effect on Muslims, where they feel like, okay, we should convert. Okay, weak, Muslims who are weak in terms of their iman, they will see the dunya, the success in the dunya, and that might lead them to leave Islam and convert to Christianity, or to become atheist, to become the religion of liberalism, to become liberal, to become modernized, to become feminists. Right? They will take from the dominant paradigm just on the basis of it being dominant. So in the same way, is the same logic that's being implied. There's no problem. Islam has no problem with dominance, right, and superiority. But it's dominance and superiority on the basis of revelation from the Creator. Allah is the one who knows, as the creator of humanity, what is going to be best for humanity, what's actually going to lead to felicity, happiness, flourishing, prosperity in the dunya and the akhirah. So we need to work towards driving the interests of the ummah, driving the interests of Islam. And this is out of a concern for all of humanity. This is a concern for all of humanity. So one thing that we should also clarify, just so that there's no confusion, that according to Islamic law, there is no such thing as forced conversion. Right? There's no such thing as going to a dhimmi, a non-Muslim, with a sword to his neck and saying either convert to Islam or die. This is prohibited, and it's on the basis of la ikraha fid din in traditional fiqh. And so that is clear, but we can't expand that concept. Okay, we cannot force conversion, fine. But we can't expand that to say that this means that there is just perfect secularism and separation of mosque and state in Islam. No, as we said, that's not the case. But, clearly, as we see from these examples, from the seerah, from the early history of Islam, from the expansion under the Khilafah of Abu Bakr, of Umar, of Uthman and Ali, when the Khilafah just went across North Africa and eastward through Asia, all the way to India and China, this expansion does not acknowledge religious freedom. These religious minorities, these other groups, came under the control of the Muslims. So we can, according to Islamic law, and we should, in these Islamic governance, force compliance. People are supposed to comply. Even if they don't believe in Islam, they comply with the dictates of the Islamic State and the Sharia. And this is, again, seen throughout practice in history. And the only people who denied that this was the case are modernists, are those who are influenced by this modern liberal project. So everything that we're saying about Islam, the reaction that people have when they recognize this reality, or they hear about certain aspects of the seerah, or they hear about the invasions of Khalid ibn Walid, the greatest general within Islamic history and world history, when they hear about these different provisions and prohibitions within the Pact of Omar, when they hear all this, they think, wow, this is so barbaric. This is so unfair. This is unjust. How can any of this be justified? Clearly, the secular system and the secular model is superior to what Islam is legislating and what the God of Islam wants for humanity. Clearly, the Western system and the secular system is so much superior to this. And this is the type of argument that is made. This is why religious freedom is necessary. So the argument goes like this. First premise, it is unjust to force people to obey laws based on beliefs they do not accept. That's premise one. Okay? It's unjust to force people to obey laws based on beliefs that they don't accept. So if someone is a Christian and you're forcing Islamic law on them, for example, you are making them pay jizya. Okay? You're making them pay a certain amount of money to the Islamic government. That is something that the Christian does not believe in. The Christian does not believe in the Sharia. The Christian does not believe in the jizya, but you're forcing him to pay that. So that is unjust. Second premise, religious laws such as found in the Sharia force religious minorities to obey laws based on Islamic beliefs that they don't accept. Okay, so we established that already with all of the examples that I gave. So the conclusion must be, therefore, the Sharia is unjust. If we take premise 1 and we add it to premise 2, then the clear conclusion is that the Sharia is unjust. So is this a valid argument? This is a question for those who took the Jadil white belt level course. You can now answer this. Is this a valid argument? You can pause the video and think about it for a second. Is it valid? And then is it sound? So the answer is yes, it is a valid argument. It's logically valid. But is it a sound argument? Is it a true argument? The answer is no. Of course it can't be a sound argument because the conclusion is false. The Sharia is just. It is perfect justice. It's the peak of morality and rationality. It's from Allah. So it cannot be unjust. So therefore, there has to be a problem with one of the premises. Are the premises true here? We can evaluate. Premise 2, the second premise, is definitely true. We established that the Sharia does force these other religious groups to obey laws that are based on Islam, and they don't accept Islam. So then the problem has to be with the first premise. It is unjust to force people to obey laws based on beliefs they do not accept. How do we answer this? How do we evaluate this and show that, in fact, this premise is false? Okay, let's look at that. We can really dismantle all of secularism and this entire first premise with one sentence. All you have to do is remember this one sentence, and you can basically argue against any kind of secularist, anyone who advocates separation of church and state. All laws and all legislation presupposes a paradigm. That's it. As long as you're able to understand this sentence and explain it, then you can dismantle secularism. So what is a paradigm? Again, just to review. Ontology, epistemology, and morality, right? That's what a paradigm is. So all laws that any country, whether it's a secular country, a Islamic country, a Christian country, all of these laws that these countries can pass have to presuppose, meaning they have to be based on a paradigm, which is ontology, epistemology, and morality. what does this mean? That means that it's impossible to have a paradigm neutral set of laws. It's impossible to have legislation that does not establish one religion, one paradigm over and above other paradigms. So even in these secular countries, every country, but secular countries included, they are establishing a paradigm. They might not call it a religion. They might not say that this is a religious law or religious ideas that we're basing our laws on, but all of these laws are presupposing a paradigm, the modernist paradigm. So they are establishing the modernist paradigm at the expense of other paradigms, including the Islamic paradigm, but also other religions as well, all other religions. They have selected one paradigm to be the law of the land. So where is the neutrality? You're forcing, because not everyone who is in these countries accepts that paradigm, right? Not everyone in these countries will accept the modernist paradigm that's being imposed on them through laws, because laws are coercive. You have to follow the law, and if you don't follow the law, you'll be arrested, you'll be put in prison, you will be fined. You will face severe consequences for breaking the law. So when that happens, you will suffer consequences, but those laws aren't necessarily on the basis of what you agree and what you believe in. So let's elaborate this a little bit more. Even the most basic laws, like traffic laws, are based on a paradigm. Think about the law where you have to stop at a red light. This is a law that presupposes a paradigm. So what is the ontology that is presupposed by the red light law? Well, ontology again means what exists. What exists? So the ontology is cars exist, human beings exist, driving exists, lights exist, the human visual system exists to recognize colors, right? So many things that are in the ontology that's assumed by this traffic law. Epistemology. How do we understand human behavior? How do we order traffic and determine what's the best, most optimal system of traffic systems? Do we use sociology? Do we use mathematical analysis? Do we look at different traffic patterns using software? So a lot of epistemological considerations that are assumed by that law, that law is based on. And then also moral considerations. For example, do we want to prevent unnecessary car accidents? That is a moral consideration. Someone could say, well, who cares? Some people might die if we don't have the red light law, but it's more important for people to get where they're going in the least amount of time. That's more important and if some people have to die for that, okay, well, that's a cost that we're willing to make. So that's a moral consideration. The morality of reducing unnecessary deaths and all of this, that's all normative. So even in the most basic traffic law, like speed limits, red lights, green lights, parking, they all assume a paradigm. Let's look at some other examples to really hammer in the concept. So property, another very big example. What is property? How do we define ownership of something? How do we define ownership of land? The idea that you have a specific parcel of land that is yours. What does that mean? Do you also own what is below that parcel? This is what's called mineral rights within different countries. So it depends like on the definition of property. Just because you own a parcel of land does not necessarily mean you own the mineral rights. It really depends on the state or the country. What about the airspace above the land? Do you own that? Can you limit who is able to access the airspace? What about in terms of who can enter your land? What are you allowed? If someone trespasses on your property, can you harm them? Can you kill them? Can you enslave them? What dictates that? All of these considerations, the basic definition of what a property is, and all the other related questions all depend on a paradigm. And only one paradigm is going to be established in property law. And when it comes to the United States, there's a very specific definition of property that is implemented. And that's establishing the modernist understanding of property. And this led to actual conflict because as the United States was expanding towards the Pacific Ocean and taking the land of Native Americans and bringing Native Americans under the control of the US government, there was a lot of conflict because Native Americans, depending on the tribe, had different conceptions of property and territorial rights and what it meant to even own a parcel of land, if that was even possible, or did they have a communal or corporate understanding of ownership. So all of those were based on their paradigm, but the US government had to impose one law. So their paradigm and their definitions were not relevant. Those were not established. In fact, they were prohibited. They were prohibited from applying their understanding, their paradigm, their religious beliefs, and it was the modernist paradigm that was imposed and established on top of them in the supposedly the secular United States, the secular separation of church and state that's supposedly found in the US Constitution. The idea of borders is the same thing. Right? What is a border? A border is not a physical thing. It's an idea, and it demarcates different territories on a specific kind of paradigm, on the basis of a specific paradigm. And many laws are based on this idea of borders that not everyone necessarily accepts because they're coming from a different paradigm. Yet the secular state imposes that one definition on everyone, regardless of whether they believe in the underlying paradigm or not. Climate change, this is just one simple example. The experts have decided that there is this dangerous climate change that's going to affect the entire globe. Therefore, there needs to be restrictions on carbon emissions. It doesn't matter what you personally believe about carbon emissions and about what the scientific data says. It's actually irrelevant. We have to impose these laws and coerce you to follow them regardless of whether you accept the beliefs or not. It's for your own good. We, the experts in power, have decided and determined what is actually beneficial for you and for humanity as a whole, and therefore we have set these laws for everyone to abide by regardless of whether they accept the underlying paradigm or not. LGBT is a great example of imposition regardless of what you personally believe. You might not think that these kinds of gay relationships are acceptable, but it doesn't matter. You have to teach it in your schools. This is about human rights. This is about what is good for people. It is bad if someone has gay feelings and they're not able to pursue that and express that. So you have to teach sexual autonomy to children in grade school. And even if you're in homeschool in some countries, you are forced to teach your kids this curriculum. Your religious beliefs are actually completely irrelevant. Same for your business. Okay? Your business needs to cater to gay weddings. Your business needs to cater to the transgendered. Doesn't matter what you believe. This is for the betterment of all of society. Hormones for your children. If your little boy, if little Bilal feels like he is not a boy, and maybe he one day wore, his mom's makeup just playing around in her bedroom and applied some makeup to his face, then that means little Bilal is actually a girl in a boy's body. And the school psychiatrist recommends that he is put on a high dose of estrogen therapy immediately. And if you as a parent disagree with that based on your religious beliefs, well, that's irrelevant. If you stand in the way, that's child abuse, and we'll have to take little Bilal away from you and fine you and put you in prison for your intolerance and bigotry. This is all based on secular principles. Okay? The secular state is imposing laws on the basis of its paradigm, the modernist paradigm, which we studied in Dark Storms and Tortured Minds in depth. And then COVID restrictions. Okay? It doesn't matter what you personally think about the coronavirus, its deadliness, and how society should or should not change in response to this virus. Doesn't matter what you think. We, as the secular state, impose restrictions and laws regardless of what you personally believe. And we can even shut down your mosque, shut down your Islamic school on our say-so, because we've determined that it's dangerous. It's for your own good. It's for your own benefit. So all of this is forcing beliefs, and it's all justified because the state knows what's best for you despite what you believe, and also the state is serving its own larger interests, and that's also seen as justified. The state has to defend and promote its own national interests, right? Whether it's with its domestic policy or with its foreign policy. This is all taken for granted when it comes to Western secular politics. So you can see the parallel. Okay? You can see the parallel with exactly what we said with the Sharia and the restrictions on non-Muslims. It's for the benefit of all, including Ahlul Dhimma, including these quote-unquote religious minorities. And it is serving the interests of the Ummah as a whole. The point being that these liberal secularists can really have no objection. They can't use this argument that we saw before about forcing beliefs is wrong, it's unjust. They can't use that argument because they're constantly doing it themselves. In their secular states, they're constantly imposing laws on the basis of a paradigm that not everyone accepts. So how can you really have an objection with Islam doing it? You have no problem with forcing beliefs. You just have a problem if Muslims do it. You just have a problem if Islam does it. And again, I'm not creating an equivalence between the modernist secular imposition and Sharia. Because at the end of the day, we can ask this question. Fine, the modernist paradigm claims that it's doing what's best for humanity, and Islam is claiming that its laws are on the basis of what's best for humanity. How can we judge between them? We can judge, we can bring the kinds of arguments and claims. For example, when we talked about adultery, when we talked about upside down with homosexuality, if you took Vanishing Throne and the issue of women's leadership, we can bring all kinds of secular information to adjudicate these kinds of questions when we're comparing Islam with the modernist paradigm. But we can just take it back for 1 second and ask a very simple question. Who knows best about what is going to be best for humanity? Is it not going to be the Creator, right? Or is it going to be a group of corrupt politicians and corporate interests who are going to work together based on their finite intelligence and often irrational understanding of the way that the world works, their limited scientific knowledge that turns out to be wrong in many cases? Should we trust them as heads of the secular state or the secular world order to determine what's best for humanity? Or should we, leave it to democracy, leave it to voting? People, the herd, will decide what is best by, putting their votes in, when they're easily manipulated, by the way, as we'll talk about when we get to the democracy section. Should we leave these important decisions about the fate of humanity in the hands of this easily manipulated herd? Or should we rely on the creator of humanity, the one who has created us, created the world, and has, out of his mercy, legislated and given us guidance through Islamic law, through the final Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on what is best for us as a race, as human beings? So this is something that is very clear for anyone who reflects on it for more than a few minutes. Okay, so again, all laws presuppose a paradigm. Keep in mind what we're saying here. Okay, we're saying that the idea of separation of church and state is inherently incoherent. It's impossible because it's logically impossible. In the same way that a square circle is impossible. It's an incoherent idea. Because if you have a law, it's going to assume a paradigm, and therefore establish a paradigm and prohibit the free exercise of other paradigms. Okay? That's the idea here. It's a fundamental incoherence. So whenever people say, or some of these modernist Muslims say, why doesn't Islam become secularized? Well, the answer to that is, well, secularism is incoherent. Why do you want Islam to conform to something that's incoherent? Of course we wouldn't want that. So laws cannot be religion-free because they cannot be paradigm-free. That's the idea. Therefore, there can be no neutrality. There can be no neutral secular playing field. As long as you're imposing laws, you are going to be imposing a paradigm or a religion. So let's go back to the religious freedom argument. We said premise 1, premise 2, premise 3. So now we know why. Premise 1 is false, okay? Because it is unjust to force people to obey laws based on beliefs they do not accept. Number 1, all countries, including the secular ones, especially the secular countries, are forcing people to obey laws based on beliefs that those people do not necessarily accept. And this is a side point. A lot of what these secular countries are concerned with is changing the psychologies of people to experience or to adopt the paradigm of the state. Right? That's a big part of what the secular state does, because it doesn't want people to experience this idea that there are laws that are forcing them to do something that they don't want to do. That becomes a threat because there could be riots, uprising. So the secular state is actually very concerned about altering people's psychologies to be in line with the modernist paradigm so that they'll be easier to rule over. They'll be more compliant subjects of the secular state, the secular order, and secular laws. Okay, that's a side point. But the point is that not only are secular countries violating this moral principle expressed in the first premise, it's impossible to have laws that aren't forcing people. Okay, so that either you say that all laws are unjust, all laws ever, the whole idea of a law is unjust, or you just acknowledge that, yeah, of course, sometimes you have to have laws that will force people to do something that they don't accept. I mean, that's the whole point of morality. You can't have morality unless you force people to accept things that they don't, or to comply with beliefs that they don't accept. That's the whole point of morality. If you claim that that's unjust, then all morality itself will break down. So this is how we can address separation of church and state. But we are going to look at some common rebuttals to this and how we can address that, inshallah, in the next module.